My son came to visit me and found me lying in the freezing garage, hungry and covered in bruises. He knelt beside my cot, his eyes wide with shock, and asked me what had happened. He wanted to know why I was living out there in the cold when I have a pension of $7,000 a month. Before I could even catch my breath to answer, my son-in-law stepped out from the house. He crossed his arms, looked down at us, and proudly told my son that the pension belonged to him now, and he was taking every last dime. My son did not say a single word. He just slowly took off his watch, set it aside on a dusty workbench, and did something that made my son-in-law shut his mouth forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, and for the entirety of my adult life I made my living as a structural engineer. I built bridges that could withstand hurricane winds, commercial high-rises that scraped the clouds, and most importantly, I built the very house I was currently trapped in. It is a sprawling $1.5 million property in a quiet, affluent suburb of Chicago. I designed every load-bearing wall, selected every piece of timber, and poured my heart into providing a sanctuary for my family. But right now, the walls I had built to protect myself felt exactly like a prison. I was lying in the center of my king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. The left side of my body felt heavy, tingling with a dull, persistent numbness that had lingered ever since a mild stroke put me in the hospital a week ago. The doctors had assured me it was a minor episode. They said that with physical therapy, rest, and a stress-free environment, I would make a full recovery and regain all of my mobility. I was supposed to be resting peacefully. I was supposed to be safe. That was the lie my daughter Valerie and her husband Derek sold me when they hastily packed their bags and moved into my home under the guise of taking care of me around the clock. The heavy oak door to my bedroom swung open suddenly. There was no knock. There was no gentle inquiry to see if I was awake, asleep, or decent. The door just crashed inward, hitting the rubber stopper on the baseboard with a dull thud. Derek marched into the room. He was 42 years old, a man whose entire personality revolved around failed real estate ventures, risky cryptocurrency bets, and a desperate need to project a level of wealth he did not actually possess. He wore a crisp dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, smelling strongly of an expensive designer cologne that I knew for a fact he bought using Valerie's credit cards. Or rather, my credit cards, which he had graciously offered to manage while I recovered. I tried to sit up, but my left arm refused to cooperate. I let out a dry, raspy cough, attempting to clear the heavy sleep from my throat. Derek did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer me a glass of water or ask if I needed my pillows adjusted. Instead, he walked straight to the side of my bed, his dark eyes locked intensely onto my left wrist. Before I could even process his intentions, his hands darted forward. His fingers were cold and rough as they grabbed my wrist. I flinched, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up my arm. "What are you doing?" I managed to croak, my voice sounding incredibly frail and weak even to my own ears. Derek ignored me completely. With a swift, practiced motion, he unclasped the vintage Omega watch from my wrist. It was a heavy silver chronometer, a deeply sentimental gift from my late wife on our 20th wedding anniversary. I wore it every single day of my life. It was practically a part of my own body, a continuous reminder of the woman I loved and the life we had built together. Derek held the watch up to the light coming through the large bay window, inspecting the scratched glass and the worn metal band with a look of greedy satisfaction. "You are bedridden, old man," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "What do you need a chronometer for? You are not exactly keeping a tight schedule anymore, are you?" I forced myself to push up on my good right elbow, fighting through the wave of dizziness that washed over me. "Derek, give that back. That belongs to me." It was a gift. He let out a short, mocking laugh, the sound grating terribly against my ears. He nonchalantly strapped the vintage timepiece onto his own wrist, adjusting the silver clasp until it fit perfectly over his pulse. "It looks much better on me anyway," he muttered, admiring his reflection in the large mirror across the room. You do not need to worry about time anymore, Harrison. Valerie and I are taking care of everything. You just lie here and rest." The sheer audacity of his words left me temporarily speechless. He was standing in the master bedroom of the home I had paid for, wearing the watch my dead wife had given me, and telling me to rest while he systematically stripped me of my dignity. I tried to reach out to grab his shirt to pull him down and demand my property back, but my weakened state betrayed me. My hand fell uselessly onto the thick wool blanket. "You have no right to come in here and take my things." I gasped, my chest heaving with the exhausting physical effort. "I want you to leave my room right now. I want you to call Valerie." Derek turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into cold, lifeless slits. He stepped closer to the bed, leaning over me until I could feel his breath on my face. "Valerie is busy," he whispered, his tone shifting instantly from mocking to overtly threatening. "She is downstairs, managing the massive financial mess you left behind. Do you have any idea how much your hospital bills cost? Do you know how much of my precious time I am wasting by staying in this house to monitor you all day long? You are a burden, Harrison. A heavy, highly expensive burden on our lives. The absolute least you can do is contribute some of your antique jewelry to the cause." I glanced frantically toward the nightstand, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My smartphone, my only lifeline to the outside world, my only way to contact my son Lucas in Texas, was gone. It had been sitting right there before I fell asleep. "Looking for this?" Derek asked with a cruel smirk. He pulled my phone from his front pocket, tapping the dark screen with his thumb. "I noticed you have been trying to call Lucas. That is simply not going to happen. The doctor said you need absolutely no stress, and your son is a very stressful topic. Valerie and I agreed it is best if we manage all of your communications from now on. We are screening your calls for your own health, of course." He tossed the phone effortlessly onto the top shelf of the tall dresser across the room, completely out of my physical reach. I stared at him, the horrifying reality of my situation and crashing down upon me like a collapsed roof. I was a strong, fiercely independent man who had managed heavy construction crews and negotiated million-dollar contracts without flinching. But in that exact moment, trapped in a failing body that refused to obey my commands, staring into the smug, greedy face of a man I had always despised, I realized I was entirely at his mercy. Derek patted my leg firmly through the thick blankets, a highly patronizing gesture that made my skin crawl with revulsion. "Just relax, Dad," he said, turning his back to me and walking toward the bedroom door. "I will have Valerie bring you some water in a few hours. That is if you are a good boy and stop your relentless complaining." He walked out of the room without another glance, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. A second later, the sharp metallic click of the deadbolt turning echoed through the silent room. I was locked in. I was trapped in the very sanctuary I had built with my own 2 hands, stripped of my timepiece, stripped of my voice, and completely isolated from the only person on earth who could help me. The overwhelming feeling of helplessness was suffocating. I lay there in the quiet room, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, realizing that my own family had executed a hostile takeover of my life. But beneath that initial terror, beneath the physical weakness, a tiny, incredibly hot spark of engineering logic began to ignite in my mind. He looked at me and saw nothing but a broken, useless old man waiting to die. He had absolutely no idea what a man with nothing left to lose was capable of building in the dark. The next evening, I gathered all the strength left in my failing body to pull myself out of bed. My left leg felt like lead against the hardwood floor. It took 20 agonizing minutes to pivot into the leather seat of my wheelchair. I was exhausted, but determined not to look completely helpless. The rich smell of roasted chicken drifted from the corridor, pulling at my empty stomach. I carefully pushed my wheels forward. The friction of the rubber tires was the only sound accompanying my strained journey. I just wanted to sit at the head of my own table, eat a hot meal, and feel like the patriarch again. As I approached the wide archway of the formal dining room, I saw the table beautifully set. Valerie was bringing a serving dish from the kitchen, laughing softly at something Derek had just said. But the moment my wheelchair crossed the threshold, the laughter abruptly stopped. Derek immediately stepped away from his chair, holding his hand up like a traffic cop. He marched over and stood squarely in my path, physically blocking me from entering the room I had designed with my own architectural blueprints. "Hold on a second, Harrison." Derek said, his voice flat. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" I looked at him, gesturing weakly toward my usual seat at the head of the mahogany table. "I am coming to eat dinner with my family," I replied, my vocal cords straining with the effort. Derek shook his head, returning his gaze to my face. "No, you are not. Look at your left arm. It is trembling uncontrollably. You are going to spill food and wine everywhere. Valerie and I just bought this authentic Persian rug, and I am not going to let your shaky hands ruin a $10,000 piece of imported silk." My chest tightened as a wave of humiliation washed over me. I looked down at the intricate rug beneath his leather shoes. He had the nerve to claim they had bought it. I knew for a fact the charge for that exact rug appeared on my credit card statement 2 weeks prior, while I was still lying in a hospital bed. It was my money paying for the floor he was standing on, yet he was using it as an excuse to banish me. Before I could defend myself, Valerie walked over her expression, a mask of feigned sympathy. "Derek is right, Dad. It is just too much of a risk right now, and you need a calm environment without the commotion of a formal dinner. It is really for your own good." Derek grabbed a plastic plate from the kitchen counter and shoved it onto my lap. It was a cold, hastily made turkey sandwich on dry bread, accompanied by a lukewarm bottle of tap water. "You can eat out here in the hallway," Derek instructed, turning to pull out a chair for his wife. "We will come collect your plate when we are finished. Do not make a mess." I forced myself to take a small bite of the dry bread, feeling the tasteless food turning to ash in my parched mouth. Every chew required an immense amount of deliberate effort. I was reduced to a mere ghost haunting the dark corridors of my own home, a man erased from his family portrait by the people he trusted most. I stared at the blank wall opposite my wheelchair, listening to their joyous laughter echoing freely from the dining room. Tears of silent frustration began to sting my tired eyes, but I absolutely refused to let them fall down my face. Hours later, the house plunged into an oppressive silence. The clock in the foyer chimed midnight. I was lying in my bed, unable to sleep, my throat painfully dry. I decided to navigate my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. I transferred my weight back into the wheelchair, fueled by a lingering, quiet anger. As I rolled silently down the darkened hallway, a strange, rhythmic rustling noise caught my attention. It was coming from the guest bedroom at the far end of the hall. The door was wide open, casting a pale yellow wedge of light across the hardwood floor. I approached the doorway cautiously, peering inside. What I saw made my blood run instantly cold. Derek was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by large black trash bags. He was pulling items out of the cedar armoire and shoving them aggressively into the bags. My heart shattered when I realized what he was throwing away. It was my late wife's belongings. He was violently stuffing her silk dresses, her cashmere sweaters, and the photo albums containing 4 decades of our shared memories into the garbage. "What are you doing?" I yelled, my voice suddenly finding its strength echoing loudly through the silent house. "Those belong to my wife. Stop touching her things." Derek froze, a silk scarf hanging limply from his fist. He slowly turned to face me, completely devoid of guilt. "I am clearing out the junk, Harrison," he said dismissively. "We need the storage space for things that actually matter. Nobody needs to look at these faded pictures of dead people." A surge of raw fury coursed through my veins. I pushed the wheels of my chair forward, intending to physically pry the bags away from him. "Put those back." Right now, I demanded, my hands gripping the armrests tightly. "You have absolutely no right to throw away my life." As my wheelchair crossed into the room, Derek dropped the scarf. He closed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. Before I could react, he placed his large hands firmly on the front of my wheelchair and shoved backward with terrifying force. The heavy chair rolled violently backward, the rear wheels catching the edge of the thick carpet. I was propelled into the hallway, slamming hard against the decorative wooden wainscoting. The sheer physical impact jarred my spine, sending a sharp pain shooting through my lower back. I gasped for air, stunned by the sudden violence. Derek stepped out of the room, towering over me in the dim light. He pointed a long finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with a dangerous intensity. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic old fool," he hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This is my house now. Everything in it belongs to me. You do not give orders here anymore. You do not make decisions here anymore. You shut your mouth, you go back to your room, and you go to sleep. If you ever raise your voice at me again, I promise you I will make your life so incredibly unbearable that you will beg me to put you in a nursing home. Do you understand me?" I stared up at the man who had infiltrated my family, my heavy chest heaving. I realized then that this was a hostile, calculated takeover. I nodded slowly. I wheeled myself back into the cold shadows of my room, the heavy oak door closing behind me, leaving me alone in the dark. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the curtains. I had not slept a wink. Every shadow felt like a threat, and every creak made my heart race. I lay perfectly still, listening to the morning routine of the house I designed. I heard the hum of the coffee maker, the clinking of mugs, and the murmur of voices. It was a normal morning, completely masking the sinister reality of what had happened just hours before. At 9, the brass handle of my bedroom door turned. The door opened with a gentle push. It was a stark contrast to the violent entrance of Derek the previous night. Valerie stepped into the room. She was 38 years old, wearing a plush robe I recognized from a shopping trip I had funded last Christmas. She carried a silver tray, holding a glass of juice and a piece of dry toast. Her face was expertly composed into an expression of deep concern. She set the tray down on my nightstand and immediately slumped onto the edge of my mattress. Before she even spoke, a perfectly timed tear rolled down her cheek. She reached out and took my right hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she stroked my knuckles with a practiced, soothing rhythm. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry about last night," she whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "I did not want to wake you up, but I have been sick with worry." I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had carried on my shoulders and sent to the best universities. I waited in silence, letting her weave her intricate web of deception. She sniffled, wiping her eyes. "Derek is under immense pressure right now, Dad. You have to understand the real estate market is crashing. His investments are tied up. His contractors are threatening to walk off the job, and the stress is eating him alive. He did not mean to snap at you in the hallway. He is carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, trying to make sure our family stays afloat while you recover." I kept my face blank, masking the absolute disgust boiling inside my chest. "He was throwing away the belongings of your mother," I said, keeping my voice low intentionally, making it sound weak and confused. "Her dresses, her photo albums, the things that matter to me." Valerie squeezed my hand tighter, leaning closer so I could smell her expensive floral perfume. "Oh, Dad, no, that is not what happened," she cooed, her tone dripping with toxic sweetness. "There was a terrible leak in that part of the house. We found black mold growing over the back wall of the cedar armoire. It had spread to the clothes of your mother and the covers of the albums. We had to bag them up and throw them out." She paused, searching my eyes for any sign of resistance. "You know how dangerous black mold spores are, especially for someone in your fragile medical condition. The doctor said your respiratory health is compromised after the stroke. Derek was just trying to protect your lungs, Dad. He was acting quickly to remove a biological hazard from the house before it made you ill. He is just terrible at communicating when he is stressed. He thought he was doing the right thing for your recovery. Please, you have to forgive him. He feels awful about how he spoke to you." I stared into the teary eyes of Valerie, listening to the smooth, seamless rhythm of her lies. I had spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer. My entire career was based on understanding the fundamental principles of load stress and structural integrity. I knew how to inspect a massive concrete foundation and identify the microscopic hairline fractures that indicated a catastrophic underlying failure. I knew what rot looked like. I knew what decay smelled like. And as I looked at my own daughter, I saw a foundation that was completely rotting from the inside out. The cedar armoire she mentioned was located on an interior wall on the second floor of the house. There were no plumbing lines running anywhere near that specific partition. There was no roof leak. The house was meticulously waterproofed and climate-controlled because I had personally designed the central ventilation system. The air in that room was as dry as a desert bone. There was absolutely no mold. There was no biological hazard. The only toxic, dangerous element in this entire house was the woman sitting on the edge of my bed and the man she had married. My gut screamed at me to expose her lie, to throw the glass of juice against the wall, and to demand that she leave my house immediately. Every instinct I possessed urged me to fight back, to tear down the facade she was building. But logic, cold and calculating, took over. I was 70 years old, partially paralyzed, and physically vulnerable. Derek had already proven he was perfectly willing to use violence against me. If I confronted them now, if I showed them that my mind was sharp and that I saw right through their elaborate deception, they would simply escalate their tactics. They would find a way to neutralize me completely. I needed time. I needed a strategy. I took a slow, labored breath, forcing my shoulders to slump in an exaggerated posture of defeat. I let my eyes wander aimlessly toward the window, mimicking the dull, vacant stare of a confused and helpless old man. "I understand, sweetheart," I murmured, letting my voice trail off weakly. "I did not know about the mold. I am just so very tired, Valerie. Everything is so confusing right now. My memory is a little cloudy. I suppose I should be thanking Derek for taking care of the hazard." A fleeting shadow of triumph flashed across the face of Valerie. The tension in her shoulders instantly vanished. She patted my hand once more, a patronizing gesture of finality. "It is okay, Dad. You do not need to worry about the details of maintaining the house anymore. That is why Derek and I are here. We are going to handle absolutely everything for you. You just focus on resting your mind and getting your strength back. Eat your toast, take a long nap, and I will check on you this afternoon." She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her robe, and walked toward the door. As she stepped out into the hallway, she did not look back. I listened to the soft padding of her slippers fading away, followed by the familiar, distinct click of the deadbolt locking me inside once again. I was alone, staring at the dry piece of toast on the silver tray. I had verbally accepted her lie, but internally, the battle lines were clearly drawn. I was no longer a father recovering from a medical setback. I was a man living behind enemy lines. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet anger sharpen into a lethal focus, knowing that my survival depended entirely on playing the role of the broken victim while preparing for war. The next 3 days passed in a blur of calculated silence and mounting suffocating tension. I remained isolated in my bedroom, expertly playing the part of the compliant, ailing father they desperately wanted me to be. I ate the cold, tasteless soup they brought me without uttering a single word of complaint. I dutifully took the colored pills Valerie placed on my nightstand, covertly hiding them beneath my tongue and spitting them into a crumpled tissue the absolute moment she turned her back and left the room. The thick, unnatural fog in my head began to clear, entirely replaced by a sharp, cold clarity that I had not felt since my active days managing high-stakes engineering projects across the state. Every single morning, I listened to the sounds of my own house being commandeered and violated. The heavy, arrogant footsteps of Derek pacing the polished hardwood floors I had painstakingly laid myself. The shrill, artificial laughter of Valerie talking on her phone with her equally vacuous friends. They operated under the arrogant assumption that I was a broken man, a fading ghost haunting the periphery of their vibrant, wealthy lives. I let them believe it wholeheartedly. I needed them to drop their guard completely. But on the morning of the fourth day, a new horrifying sound shattered the fragile quiet of my confinement. It was not the usual clinking of expensive coffee mugs or the muffled hum of the downstairs television. It was the heavy rhythmic thud of thick work boots marching aggressively up my grand staircase. Dozens of them. Then came the unmistakable violent crash of solid metal striking drywall. The sound reverberated violently through the floorboards, shaking the glass of water resting on my nightstand. I pushed myself upright, swinging my legs over the edge of the mattress with deliberate effort. My left side was still weak, lacking its former strength, but the pure anger coursing through my veins provided a massive surge of adrenaline. I managed to pivot and lower myself into my wheelchair, just as the door to my bedroom was thrown open without warning. A thick cloud of white drywall dust billowed into the room, stinging my eyes and coating the back of my throat with a dry, chalky film. Derek stood confidently in the doorway, wearing a tailored gray suit, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. Behind him down the long hallway, I could clearly see 3 burly contractors wielding massive sledgehammers. They were systematically demolishing the custom-tiled walls of my master bathroom. The beautiful imported travertine tiles I had sourced directly from Italy, the very ones my late wife had spent weeks carefully selecting, were being mercilessly smashed into jagged, ruined shards. The noise was absolutely deafening, a brutal physical assault on my senses. "What in the world is going on out here?" I demanded, raising my voice to be heard over the relentless destruction. "What are those men doing to my bathroom?" Derek took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He stepped casually into my room, completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding just feet away. "We are making some necessary renovations, Harrison," he said smoothly, a wide, predatory smile stretching across his face. "Valerie and I have some incredibly wonderful news. We are expecting a baby." I stared at him, the lie I had uncovered in the medical portal of Valerie flashing brightly in my mind. She was not pregnant. It was a complete fabrication, a calculated cold-blooded excuse to execute the next aggressive phase of their hostile takeover. But I kept my expression carefully blank, forcing a look of mild, confused surprise. "A baby," I repeated, ensuring my vocal tone sounded sufficiently weak and bewildered. "That is wonderful news, Derek. But why are they destroying my bathroom?" Derek sighed loudly, shaking his head side to side, as if he were dealing with a slow, particularly frustrating child. "Because, Harrison, this house does not have a proper modern nursery. The guest rooms are far too small, and we absolutely need a spacious, comfortable environment for the baby. This master suite is the only logical choice. It has the square footage we need. The contractors are knocking down the bathroom wall to expand the space and create a proper open-concept playroom. You are going to have to relocate immediately." Relocate where I asked, my grip tightening aggressively on the rubber armrests of my wheelchair. "There are 4 large bedrooms in this majestic house. Where exactly do you expect me to go?" Derek stepped closer, his fake smile vanishing, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated contempt. "Not in the house, old man. You are a massive physical liability. You need ground floor access. We simply cannot have you tumbling down the stairs and causing another massive medical emergency that we have to clean up. We have prepared a special safe space just for you." Before I could voice another objection or mount a defense, Derek moved swiftly behind my wheelchair. He grabbed the rubber push handles with a punishing grip and shoved me forward. I was jolted forcefully as the front wheels bounced over the wooden threshold of my bedroom. He pushed me quickly down the hallway, rolling me right past the contractors, who were laughing loudly and swinging their heavy hammers into my cherished memories. The dust hung incredibly thick in the air, coating my tongue with a bitter taste. We reached the top of the grand staircase. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, I thought he might simply push me down the steep steps and end it all. Instead, he navigated me sharply toward the back of the house, toward the spacious service elevator I had installed years ago for moving heavy furniture. We descended in absolute suffocating silence. The metal doors opened to the tiled mudroom, and Derek pushed me roughly through the heavy reinforced fire door that led directly into the detached garage. The moment we crossed the threshold, a brutal blast of freezing Chicago air hit my face like a physical blow. It was mid-November, and the large garage was entirely uninsulated against the bitter elements. The solid concrete floor radiated a bone-chilling cold that instantly seeped through the soles of my thin slippers. The vast space smelled strongly of leaked motor oil, old wet cardboard, and damp lingering mildew. Derek rolled me into the center of the echoing room and abruptly stopped the chair. He walked over to the concrete wall and aggressively hit a plastic switch, illuminating a single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. The harsh, buzzing light revealed the cruel, undeniable reality of my new accommodations. In the far corner, wedged tightly between a stack of dirty winter tires and a broken, rusted lawnmower, sat a flimsy, military-style cot. It was covered with a single paper-thin gray blanket. Beside it stood a small, wobbly plastic folding table. There was no bathroom facilities. There was no running water. There was only a rusted, broken space heater sitting uselessly in the cold corner. "This is a sick joke," I said, my breath turning instantly into white mist in the freezing air. "You cannot possibly expect me to live out here. I will freeze to death in a matter of days. This is a garage, Derek. I am an old man recovering from a medical stroke." Derek leaned casually against the sleek hood of his brand-new Porsche Panamera, crossing his arms over his chest, in a display of supreme arrogance. "It is a perfectly adequate space, Harrison. It is flat. It is highly accessible. You will not have to worry about falling down the stairs. We will bring you your daily meals. You have absolutely everything you need right here." A surge of genuine fiery anger finally broke completely through my carefully maintained facade. I pushed my wheels forward with all my remaining strength, closing the physical distance between us. "I am not a stray dog to be chained up in the yard." I barked, my voice echoing loudly off the bare concrete walls. "I am the legal owner of this house. Furthermore, I am an independent man with substantial resources. I receive a pension of $7,000 every single month. If you do not want me inside the house, fine. Use my money to hire a full-time in-home nurse. Use my money to rent me a comfortable, warm apartment in the city. You have absolutely no right to banish me to a freezing concrete floor when I can easily afford proper, dignified care." Derek threw his head back and let out a loud, theatrical laugh. The harsh sound bounced around the garage, sharp and incredibly cruel. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of white papers. He tossed them casually onto my lap. They landed with a heavy thud against my weakened legs. "Your pension." He mocked, his dark eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You really have absolutely no grasp on reality anymore. Do you? Look at those papers, Harrison. Look at the itemized list of your astronomical medical expenses from the hospital. Look at the cost of the imported medications, the daily physical therapy consultations, the highly specialized dietary requirements Valerie has been carefully preparing for you." I looked down at the typed papers, though I already knew precisely what they were. They were completely fabricated invoices, fake bills meticulously designed to drain my accounts dry and justify their theft. "Your precious $7,000 a month barely even begins to cover the massive mountain of medical debt you racked up, old man." Derek sneered, stepping aggressively closer, towering menacingly over my wheelchair. "You do not have a single dime to your name. Your pension goes directly toward keeping you alive, and frankly, it is not nearly enough. You are a massive, overwhelming financial burden on this family. You are bleeding us dry. You should be down on your knees thanking Valerie and me for giving you a roof over your head, even if it is a concrete one." I stared up at him, gripping the fake invoices in my trembling hands. "You are stealing from me," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You are taking my money." Derek bent down until we were eye to eye. His expression was utterly devoid of human empathy. "I am managing your estate, Harrison, because you are clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. You are terribly confused, you are combative, and you are wildly ungrateful. Now you will stay in this garage. You will keep quiet, and you will wait for the end. Because nobody out there is coming to save you." He stood up tall, brushing a microscopic speck of dust from his pristine lapel. He walked confidently toward the heavy fire door, leading back into the luxurious warmth of the house. Without looking back, he stepped through the doorway. The heavy steel door slammed shut. A moment later, I heard the distinct heavy slide of the deadbolt locking firmly into place. I was locked out. The bitter cold air immediately began to bite viciously at my exposed skin. I sat alone in the center of the vast, freezing garage, staring intensely at the locked door. My breath plumed continuously in the freezing air. The silence was absolute. He truly thought he had buried me alive. He thought he had successfully stripped me of my financial resources, my personal dignity, and my future. But as I slowly looked around the cluttered garage, my eyes landing directly on the stacked boxes of discarded junk piled high against the far brick wall, a cold, calculating resolve settled deep within my chest. I was a structural engineer. Give me concrete, give me scrap metal, give me time, and I can build a bridge to absolutely anywhere in the world. The first night in that freezing concrete box was a brutal test of my physical endurance. The thin gray blanket offered virtually no protection against the biting Chicago cold that seeped upward through the floorboards. I lay on the narrow military cot, my breath forming pale clouds in the dim light. My left side throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a lingering reminder of the stroke that had betrayed my body. But my mind was racing. I watched the shadows stretch across the stacked tires and broken lawnmowers, mapping out the dimensions of my new reality. When morning finally broke, slipping through the frosted glass of the small garage window, I felt completely exhausted. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy steel fire door creaked open. Valerie stepped into the garage, tightly wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders to ward off the chill. She carried a small plastic tray. On it sat a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal and a tiny paper cup containing my daily blood pressure medication. She did not look around the garage. She did not ask how I had slept or if I was warm enough. She simply placed the tray on the wobbly folding table beside my cot, forcing a tight, artificial smile. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice brisk and entirely devoid of warmth. "You need to eat this quickly and take your pills. Derek has contractors coming in to measure the master suite, and we need to keep things moving." I nodded slowly, playing the part of the compliant, broken old man. I reached for the paper cup, my hand trembling convincingly. As I tipped the pills into my palm, I paused. I had been taking the same blood pressure medication for over 5 years. I knew the exact shape, the precise chalky texture, and the specific pale yellow hue of those tiny tablets. The pills sitting in my palm right now were different. They were slightly larger, coated in a smooth white shell, and completely unmarked. "What are these?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and confused. "They do not look like my usual prescription." Valerie sighed, an exasperated sound that echoed loudly in the cavernous space. "The doctor changed your dosage at the hospital, Dad. Remember, he said you needed something stronger to manage the stress on your heart. Just take them so you can rest. You know how agitated you get when you miss your medication." I stared at the white pills. For the past 4 days, ever since Derek and Valerie had moved into my home, I had been experiencing a terrifying, unnatural lethargy. An hour after taking my morning medication, a thick, suffocating fog would roll into my brain. My limbs would feel like they were submerged in wet cement. I would struggle to keep my eyes open, often drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep that consumed the entire afternoon. I had blamed this profound exhaustion on the stroke. I had assumed my body was simply demanding the rest it needed to heal the damaged neural pathways. But as a structural engineer, that my entire life was governed by the laws of cause and effect. If a support beam buckled, there was a specific, calculable reason. If a foundation cracked, there was a hidden source of stress. My mind was the foundation of my existence, and it was currently crumbling under a load that made no logical sense. The stroke had affected my motor skills, not my cognitive function. This heavy chemical dampening was artificial. It was a deliberate, engineered failure. I looked up at Valerie. She was tapping her foot impatiently against the concrete floor, watching me with an intense, calculating gaze. She was waiting for the structural collapse. She was waiting for the medication to take effect so she could return to her comfortable life inside my house. "Okay, sweetheart," I murmured, raising my trembling hand toward my mouth. "Thank you for taking such good care of me." I placed the white pills onto my tongue and reached for the glass of water. As I brought the rim to my lips, I executed a maneuver I had not practiced since my college days. With a swift flick of my tongue, I tucked the smooth tablets deeply into the pocket of my cheek, right against my lower gums. I took a large gulp of the cold water, swallowing audibly, and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. I opened my mouth slightly, showing her my empty tongue. "There," I said, leaning back heavily against the thin pillow. "All gone. I think I will just close my eyes for a little while. I am feeling very tired today." Valerie smiled, a genuine expression of profound relief. "That is a good idea, Dad. Just rest. We will take care of everything else." She picked up the empty paper cup, turned on her heel, and walked briskly back into the house. The heavy fire door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding firmly into place. The moment I was entirely alone, I leaned over the edge of the cot and spat the white pills into a crumpled tissue. I wrapped them tightly in the paper and shoved them deep into the pocket of my pajama pants. My heart pounded a furious rhythm against my ribs. I lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar suffocating fog to descend upon my mind. Hour after hour passed. The sun climbed higher, casting a cold, brilliant beam of light across the dusty concrete floor. The fog never came. Instead, a sharp, brilliant clarity began to wash over me. The sluggishness in my thoughts evaporated, leaving behind a crisp, highly focused awareness. My mind felt like a finely tuned machine running on premium fuel. The difference was absolute and terrifying. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. They were not managing my recovery. They were actively poisoning me. They were feeding me powerful, unregulated sedatives to intentionally induce a state of chemical submission. They needed me docile. They needed me confused, lethargic, and entirely dependent on them. An alert, highly functional structural engineer with access to his bank accounts was a massive threat to their hostile takeover. A drugged, heavily sedated old man wasting away in a freezing garage was simply a convenient tragedy waiting to reach its natural conclusion. The sheer malice of their plan took my breath away. It was one thing to steal my vintage watch or banish me from my own dining room. It was an entirely different level of evil to systematically strip away my cognitive autonomy using chemical restraints. Valerie, my own flesh and blood, the daughter I had protected and nurtured, was looking me right in the eye every single morning and handing me a daily dose of mental paralysis. She was a willing, active participant in my slow, agonizing execution. I lay perfectly still on the cheap cot, processing the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. The cold air of the garage no longer bothered me. The pain in my left arm seemed to fade entirely into the background. A profound, icy resolve began to harden in the very core of my being. They thought they had neutralized the threat. They believed their chemical handcuffs were keeping me safely secured in the dark, but they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. By failing to ensure I swallowed those pills, they had accidentally handed me back my greatest weapon. My mind was my most valuable asset, the very tool that had built the wealth they were currently stealing. Now that the chemical fog was lifting, I could clearly see the entire blueprint of their deception. I could identify the load-bearing walls of their lies, and I knew exactly where to place the explosive charges to bring their entire world crashing down around them. I spent the remainder of the day practicing my physical movements. Without the heavy sedatives dragging me down, I found that the strength in my left side was actually returning much faster than I had previously thought. The stroke had been mild, just as the doctors had promised. With deliberate, focused effort, I managed to stand up from the wheelchair. I gripped the cold metal frame tightly, putting weight on my left leg. It trembled, sending sharp spikes of protest up my thigh, but it held. I took a slow, agonizing step forward, then another. I was far from perfectly healthy, but I was no longer the helpless cripple they needed me to be. When Valerie returned late in the afternoon with a bowl of tepid soup, I made sure to dramatically slur my words. I let my head loll loosely against my chest, staring at hers with glazed, unfocused eyes. I drooled slightly, playing the part of a man whose brain had been thoroughly cooked by heavy medication. She looked down at me with an expression of absolute disgust, pushing the bowl roughly onto the folding table before turning away. She did not see the sharp, calculating intelligence burning brightly behind my half-closed eyelids. She did not realize that while she was looking at a dying old man, she was actually staring at a highly motivated engineer who was currently drafting the blueprints for her ultimate destruction. I would continue to spit out their poison every single day. I would let them operate under the fatal assumption of my profound weakness, and when the perfect moment finally arrived, I would strike with a precision and a fury they could never possibly anticipate. The following evening, the biting chill of the garage deepened. I sat on the edge of the flimsy cot, pulling the thin gray blanket tightly around my shoulders. My senses were heightened, completely free from the toxic fog of the medication I had been secretly spitting out. Every sound from the main house and the driveway was magnified in the quiet isolation of my concrete cell. Around 7 o'clock, a deep guttural roar shattered the peaceful quiet of the suburban neighborhood. It was not the familiar hum of the practical sedan Derek usually drove. This was the aggressive, unmistakable growl of a highly tuned sports engine. The sound grew much louder, vibrating heavily through the thin drywall of the garage, before settling into a low, menacing purr just on the other side of the garage door. I slowly pushed myself up from the cot, my left leg supporting my weight, much better than it had just days prior. I limped quietly toward the large metal door, pressing my ear firmly against the freezing surface. I heard the heavy thud of a car door closing, followed by the arrogant voice of Derek. He was showing off his new purchase to a neighbor. It was a brand new Porsche Panamera. I listened to him brag endlessly about the custom leather interior, the twin turbocharged engine, and the exorbitant price tag he had paid. He spoke with the careless ease of a man who had not worked a single honest day to earn the absolute luxury he was currently flaunting. My blood boiled fiercely. I knew instantly how he had afforded such an extravagant machine. He was using the wealth I had spent 40 demanding years building block by block. Later that night, long after the neighborhood had fallen asleep, and the thick winter frost had settled heavily on the garage windows, I heard the side door of the main house open. Heavy footsteps crunched loudly on the frozen gravel of the driveway. It was Derek. He was pacing back and forth just inches away from the thin drywall separating my freezing prison from the outside world. He was talking loudly on his cell phone, his voice carrying exceptionally clearly through the crisp, silent night air. He sounded frantic, highly animated, and utterly ruthless in his specific demands. I pressed myself perfectly flat against the cold wall, holding my breath, listening intently to every single word he spoke into the receiver. He was talking to a broker, someone who managed high-risk cryptocurrency investments. "Listen to me very carefully," Derek hissed into the phone, the sound of his leather shoes grinding sharply against the gravel. "The market is dipping right now, and this is our perfect window. I need you to execute the transfer immediately. Pump another 200 grand directly into the offshore account today." The voice on the other end of the line must have raised a serious concern about liquid assets, because Derek let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Do not worry about liquidity," he snapped back, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated greed. "We have a continuous, guaranteed supply of cash. The old man in the garage is an absolute goldmine. His pension and his savings are routing straight to my limited liability company. It is a completely automated process. He is locked away safely, totally medicated, and completely out of the picture. Just make the transfer and secure the digital assets before the morning bell rings." I stood frozen entirely against the wall, the sheer magnitude of his spoken words echoing in my mind like a controlled demolition. It was not just a few missed credit card payments or a stolen vintage watch. This was a massive, highly systematic plundering of my entire life savings. They had somehow rerouted my monthly pension of $7,000. They had completely drained my accounts and funneled my hard-earned money into an offshore account to fund his reckless financial gambling and his luxury sports vehicles. He had legally and financially erased me from the world while I was still drawing breath. The structural integrity of my entire financial existence had been completely compromised by my own family. The profound shock of that late-night revelation lingered heavily into the next morning. I retreated to my cot, pretending to be trapped in a deep, highly medicated slumber when the heavy fire door finally swung open. It was nearly noon. Valerie walked in wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater that I recognized immediately. I had purchased that exact sweater for her mother in Paris nearly a decade ago. She carried a chipped plastic bowl filled with cold, watery vegetable soup. She set it down roughly on the plastic folding table, eager to leave the freezing garage as quickly as humanly possible. I forced my eyes open, blinking sluggishly, maintaining the elaborate facade of a broken, senile old man. "Valerie," I whispered, letting my voice crack with beautifully manufactured desperation. "Valerie, please stay here for just a moment," she sighed dramatically, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "What is it, Dad? I have a massage appointment in exactly an hour, and I absolutely cannot be late." I looked up at her, allowing genuine tears of profound frustration to pool slowly in the corners of my eyes. "Please, sweetheart," I pleaded softly. "I need you to call Lucas. I just want to hear his voice today. Please let me speak to my son." Lucas was my 35-year-old son. He was a former Marine, a man of uncompromising honor and fierce loyalty. We had always shared a profound, deeply unspoken bond. When his beautiful mother passed away, Lucas was the one who stood constantly by my side, silently anchoring me to the earth, while the overwhelming grief threatened to wash me away. He had moved to Texas a few years ago for his specialized career, but we always maintained a close relationship. If Lucas knew I was out here shivering uncontrollably on a cheap cot and being fed cold soup, he would tear the garage door off its hinges with his bare hands. He was my only genuine hope. Valerie stared down at me, her expression hardening instantly into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated cruelty. A cruel smirk played lightly at the corners of her mouth. "I tried to call him Dad," she said, her voice dripping with sickly, artificial pity. "I really did try. But Lucas simply does not care about you anymore." I shook my head weakly, pretending the terrible words were breaking my fragile heart, even though I knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that she was boldly lying. "That is simply not true," I stammered, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "Lucas would never abandon me. He is a good, loyal boy. Please just let me use your mobile phone." Valerie stepped back quickly, completely avoiding my desperate touch. "It is the absolute truth," she said coldly. "He told me that your medical condition is simply too much to handle. He said you are a massive emotional burden, and he does not have the time or the energy to deal with a sick, dying old man. He blocked our numbers, Dad. He explicitly told us never to contact him again. You are entirely on your own now. It is just Derek and me taking care of you. So you need to stop asking for people who do not want you eat your soup and go to sleep." She turned her back on me and walked confidently out of the dark garage. The heavy steel door slammed shut loudly behind her, the lock engaging with a loud, absolute final click. I was plunged back into the freezing silence of my concrete cell. The isolation they had designed was now absolute and total. They had cut off my communication, drained my financial resources, stripped me of my personal dignity, and systematically tried to poison my vulnerable mind. They honestly believed that they had won, that they had successfully eliminated the only variable that could stand in the way of their complete financial takeover. I sat up slowly, pushing the bowl of cold soup away. I did not shed a single tear. The deep sadness that had momentarily gripped my heart vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, fiercely burning focus. Valerie had made a critical, fatal error in her aggressive psychological warfare. By invoking the name of Lucas and twisting his honorable character into something ugly and callous, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I knew my son. I knew his true character, his resilience, and his unyielding sense of duty. He had not abandoned me. He was simply blind to the situation, blinded by the elaborate smokescreen Valerie and Derek had meticulously constructed to hide their terrible crimes. I needed to stop waiting for a rescue and engineer my own escape. The freezing temperature in the garage was a harsh reminder of the stakes. I slowly pushed myself up from the flimsy cot, pulling the thin gray blanket tighter around my shoulders. My left leg, though still weak, supported my weight with a newfound stubborn resilience. I limped toward the towering mountain of black trash bags and cardboard boxes Derek had indiscriminately shoved against the far brick wall. These were the discarded fragments of my life, the physical manifestations of his absolute contempt. I began to sift through the bags, my hands moving with deliberate, quiet caution. The garage was entirely dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the frosted, narrow windows. I desperately needed a light source. I rummaged through a cardboard box, labeled with my own handwriting, finding an assortment of old camping gear. My fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a tactical flashlight. I pressed the rubber button, and a brilliant beam of white light sliced through the dusty darkness. I angled the beam downward, illuminating the piles of discarded junk. I carefully opened the next box, finding a tangle of old electronic equipment. There were outdated digital cameras, tangled power cords, and obsolete charging bricks. Digging deeper into the bottom of the box, my hand struck a smooth, flat surface. I pulled it out into the harsh beam of the flashlight. It was an old laptop, a heavy, outdated model I had used extensively years ago for fieldwork. The protective outer casing was deeply scratched, and a jagged spiderweb crack ran directly across the center of the dark screen. But it was a machine, and machines possessed an inherent underlying logic. If the internal components were still viable, I could use it. I pressed the power button, holding my breath. A faint mechanical whirring sound emanated from the internal fan, followed by a dim, flickering glow from the cracked screen. The operating system began a slow, agonizingly sluggish boot sequence. It was barely functional, but it was alive. I had my terminal. Now I just needed a connection. I knew Derek had undoubtedly changed the wireless network password the moment he seized control of the house. I needed a hardwired link to bypass his digital blockade. I directed my flashlight back into the box of tangled cords, searching for a lifeline. I pulled out a thick, gray cable. It was an Ethernet cord, a long network line. But as I pulled the entire length free from the box, my heart sank heavily. The cord had been violently severed. It was sliced completely in half, rendering it utterly useless in its damaged state. I stared at the frayed, exposed copper wires poking out from the severed ends. A lesser man might have thrown it aside in absolute despair, but I was not a lesser man. I was a structural engineer. My entire professional life had been defined by the ability to connect broken pieces and build functional, resilient pathways. I placed the damaged cable carefully onto the wobbly plastic folding table beside my cot. I needed a tool. I aimed my flashlight back into the box of camping gear, rummaging through the metallic clinking of tent pegs and rusted carabiners. At the very bottom, hidden beneath a canvas tarp, I found it. A simple, rusted pocket knife. The blade was dull and heavily oxidized, but it was exactly what I needed. I carried the knife back to the folding table, taking a slow, steadying breath. My left hand still trembled, plagued by the lingering erratic aftershocks of the stroke, but I forced my fingers into a tight, uncompromising grip. I flipped open the rusted blade, resting the severed end of the gray cable against the hard plastic edge of the table. The process required an excruciating level of microscopic precision. Inside the thick outer jacket of the Ethernet cord were incredibly thin, fragile copper wires, each coated in a different colored plastic insulation. I had to strip the outer jacket without damaging the delicate internal lines, and then carefully splice each corresponding colored wire back together to restore the continuous flow of data. I pressed the dull edge of the rusted knife against the gray casing, applying a perfectly measured amount of downward pressure. I rotated the blade slowly, scoring the tough plastic jacket. My vision blurred momentarily from the intense, demanding focus, but I blinked the fatigue away, refusing to stop. With a sharp tug, I pulled the gray casing free, exposing the vibrant, twisted pairs of tiny wires. I repeated the exact same meticulous process on the other severed half of the cable. Now came the truly punishing challenge. I had to strip a fraction of an inch of insulation from each of the microscopic wires using a rusted, inadequate blade. I held the first wire, a tiny strand of solid orange, between my trembling thumb and index finger. I scraped the knife gently against the plastic coating, praying I would not sever the fragile copper core. The rusted blade caught, slipping dangerously close to my own skin. I adjusted my grip and pulled. A tiny strip of orange plastic slid off, revealing the gleaming conductive copper beneath. I let out a slow, shaky breath. One down, many more to go. The garage was freezing, the temperature hovering dangerously close to freezing, but beads of warm sweat formed continuously across my forehead. The physical exertion, combined with the intense mental strain, was utterly exhausting. My left hand ached with a dull, throbbing intensity, the muscles cramping painfully from the sustained, delicate work. Every time my fingers twitched involuntarily, I forced myself to pause to breathe and to regain absolute control over my failing body. I would not allow Derek to win. I would not let his chemical poison or his calculated cruelty break my resolve. I worked systematically, pairing the solid orange wire with the solid orange wire, twisting the exposed copper strands tightly together to create a secure, conductive bond. Then the striped orange, the solid green, the striped green. Hour after agonizing hour passed in the freezing, silent darkness. The only sounds were the faint, rhythmic scraping of the rusted knife and my own labored, steady breathing. My fingertips were raw, bleeding slightly from tiny accidental cuts, but I did not stop. I twisted the final pair of brown wires together, securing the last fragile connection. The cable was ugly, bound together with a desperate, improvised mess of twisted copper, but the circuit was fundamentally complete. The physical bridge was officially rebuilt. I now possessed a functional network cable, but I still faced a massive obstacle. I needed to route the other end directly into the main router located inside the house. I knew the exact layout of the property because I had personally drafted the blueprints. The communications hub was situated in the utility closet located directly on the other side of the shared garage wall. The heavy fire door was locked from the outside. However, I remembered a tiny detail from the original construction plans. There was a small ventilation duct designed to regulate the air pressure between the mudroom and the garage. It was positioned low on the shared wall, hidden discreetly behind a heavy wooden storage rack. I limped over to the wall, dragging the spliced cable behind me. I pushed my weight against the wooden rack, ignoring the sharp pain in my left shoulder, and shoved it aside. The metal grate of the ventilation hole was covered in dust. I used the handle of the rusted pocket knife to pry the metal cover loose, pulling it away to reveal a narrow tunnel leading directly into the utility closet. I fed the end of the cable into the dark hole, pushing it forward inch by inch. I listened carefully, tracking the scraping sound of the plastic cord sliding across the metal ductwork. I pushed until I felt the connector drop freely into the open space on the other side. Now I had to blindly navigate the plug into the port of the router. I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact placement of the equipment rack inside the closet. I maneuvered the stiff Ethernet cable, twisting it slightly, probing the dark space. I felt the hard plastic connector bump against a metallic object. I adjusted the angle, shifting it an inch to the right. My fingers felt the sudden resistance of the router casing. I pushed forward, gently sliding the connector along the back panel. A loud, solid click echoed faintly through the ventilation duct. The direct connection was completely and physically established. I pulled the remaining slack back into the freezing garage, plugging the other end directly into my battered laptop. A small yellow warning icon pulsed steadily over the standard network symbol. Suddenly, the warning sign vanished. The words, "Connected to network," appeared clearly on the screen. The isolation was officially broken. I was back online and I was completely ready for war. The screen of the battered laptop flickered, casting a pale, ghostly glow across my exhausted face. The small yellow warning icon vanished, entirely replaced by the solid, reassuring bars of an active network connection. I sat frozen for a long moment, my raw fingertips hovering just above the worn plastic keys. The freezing temperature inside the detached garage was relentless, biting through my thin gray blanket and settling deep into my aching bones. My breath formed steady white plumes in the frigid air. I was exhausted, physically battered, and entirely isolated from the outside world. But the digital bridge I had just forged through the ventilation duct was a lifeline. I was no longer a helpless prisoner waiting to quietly expire in the dark. I opened a fresh browser window. The processor whirred loudly, protesting the sudden demand. My primary objective was to assess the structural damage they had inflicted upon my financial foundation. I typed the web address for my primary banking institution. The keystrokes sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the garage. My hands were shaking from a potent mixture of raw adrenaline and mounting dread. I carefully entered my username and my long, complex password. The banking portal possessed secondary security protocols requiring a verification code sent to my mobile device. Derek had confiscated my smartphone on the first day of his occupation. However, I had spent 4 decades anticipating systemic failures and building robust contingencies. I had linked a secondary heavily encrypted email address to all my financial accounts. Years ago, a private failsafe nobody knew about. I selected the email verification option, logged into my hidden inbox, retrieved the 6-digit security code, and pressed enter. The loading circle spun in the center of the cracked screen. Round and round it went, an agonizing loop stretching the seconds into absolute eternities. My chest tightened painfully. The screen finally refreshed, loading the dashboard of my comprehensive financial portfolio. The bright numbers burned themselves directly into my retinas. I stopped breathing. The massive, high-yield savings account I had meticulously built over 40 demanding years of structural engineering was completely decimated. The balance, which had sat comfortably at over $500,000 just prior to my medical emergency, now displayed a terrifying, miserable zero. I stared at the single digit, my mind struggling to process the visual data. $500,000, the protective buffer I had constructed to ensure my comfortable retirement, had vanished into thin air. A cold, suffocating wave of pure panic threatened to crash over me, but I aggressively pushed it back. Panic was an emotion for victims, and I had firmly decided to stop being a victim. I navigated with sharp, deliberate clicks to the detailed transaction history. The ledger populated instantly, revealing a massive, highly calculated hemorrhage of my assets. 3 weeks ago, while I was still lying unconscious in a sterile hospital bed, a series of enormous, staggered wire transfers had been initiated. $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 at a time. The destination for every single outbound transaction was a routing number attached to an entity listed simply as Vanguard Holdings LLC. Derek had established a corporate shell, a financial black hole designed specifically to swallow my life savings without raising immediate suspicion. I clicked on my primary checking account, the central hub where my monthly corporate pension of $7,000 was automatically deposited. I needed to see exactly how he was managing my ongoing guaranteed monthly income. The screen loaded the recent activity. My pension deposit had arrived perfectly on schedule on the first day of the month. However, less than 2 hours after the funds had cleared, an automated clearinghouse withdrawal had swept the entire $7,000 out of the account. The destination was identical. Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Derek was not simply draining the deep well of my past labor. He had successfully installed a permanent parasitic siphon on my future survival. He was literally stealing the food from my mouth and the warmth from my freezing body to fund his luxury sports vehicles and his high-risk offshore cryptocurrency gambles. But a massive wire transfer of $500,000 from a secured banking institution required severe authorization. I opened a new search tab, my raw fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic, desperate energy. I bypassed the bank and logged directly into the digital portal of the county clerk. I paid the minor search fee using a dormant low-limit credit card they had clearly forgotten to confiscate. I typed my own legal name into the public records database and initiated the intensive search query. The database returned a single, freshly filed document registered just 3 days after my stroke. I clicked the link to download the file. A digital document in portable document format opened on my screen. I leaned forward, squinting through the jagged crack in the monitor. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Durable Power of Attorney." My stomach plummeted violently. I scrolled rapidly through the dense, highly technical legal jargon. The document granted Derek absolute, unrestricted authority over my entire estate. It gave him the legal right to manage my bank accounts, liquidate my assets, sell my physical properties, and make binding medical decisions on my behalf. I scrolled to the very last page, my eyes locking onto the signature line. There, written in smooth, flowing black ink, was my signature. Harrison Vales. It was a masterpiece of forgery. The loops, the specific slant of the letters, the precise pressure points were impeccably duplicated. If I had not known with absolute, unshakable certainty that I had been fighting for my life in an intensive care unit on the date this document was supposedly signed and notarized, I would have sworn I wrote it myself. They had planned this aggressive takeover down to the finest, most microscopic detail. They had constructed a flawless legal cage around my life. Derek was not just stealing from me. According to the laws of the state, he was merely managing the assets of a medically compromised, cognitively deficient old man. Any attempt to walk into a police station and report a theft would be immediately blocked by this piece of paper. I sat back on the wobbly cot, the sheer magnitude of their legal and financial fortification pressing down on my shoulders. But a structural engineer knows that every fortress, no matter how heavily reinforced, possesses a critical weak point. You just have to find the foundational lie that supports the entire structure. My mind raced back to the morning Derek and the contractors began demolishing my master bathroom with heavy sledgehammers. They had boldly claimed Valerie was pregnant. If that foundational premise was a fabrication, the entire narrative of their sympathetic, burdened family routine would shatter. I closed the county records tab and opened a new window. I navigated directly to the online patient portal of the regional healthcare network. For years, I had maintained administrative access to the family portal. Valerie had never bothered to revoke my access privileges, likely assuming I was far too technologically illiterate or cognitively impaired to ever utilize the system. I entered my credentials holding my breath as the authentication protocol processed. The screen refreshed, displaying the central medical dashboard. I clicked on the profile specifically designated for Valerie. I bypassed the general summaries and dug directly into the chronological visit history. If she were truly pregnant, there would be a distinct, undeniable trail of digital evidence. There would be recent appointments logged with an obstetrician, detailed blood panels for human chorionic gonadotropin levels, and scheduled ultrasound imaging. I scrolled through the detailed records for the past 6 months. There was an appointment with a dermatologist for cosmetic treatments. There was a routine dental cleaning. There was a prescription refill for highly expensive elective anti-anxiety medication. I expanded every single file, reading the physician notes with a cold, predatory focus. There was absolutely nothing. Not a single mention of pregnancy maternity care or prenatal vitamins. I expanded my search, filtering the entire database for any laboratory results processed under her name within the last 90 days. The system returned a negative result. The truth hit me with a brutal, crystalline clarity. She was not expecting a child. The pregnancy was a calculated theatrical lie. There was no child. There was no urgent, heartwarming need for a sprawling, open-concept nursery. The loud, violent destruction of my master bathroom was nothing more than an aggressive vanity project funded entirely by my stolen wealth. They had manufactured a joyful family milestone specifically to mask a hostile, illegal eviction. I reached out with raw, bleeding fingertips and carefully closed the screen of the battered laptop. The isolation they had imposed upon me was absolute. I had mapped the exact dimensions of their betrayal, and I was finally ready to burn their empire to the ground. The digital blood trail I had uncovered was absolutely damning, but as a man who had spent his entire life building structures meant to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes, I knew it was not quite enough. Financial records could be contested in a court of law. Derek could hire defense attorneys using my own stolen money to claim I had authorized those transfers before my stroke. He could argue that the power of attorney, despite being a blatant forgery, was executed with my blessing. I needed something far more visceral, something that no lawyer could ever explain away to a judge. I needed irrefutable proof of his physical malice and his emotional abuse. I needed the world to hear exactly what was happening inside this freezing garage. The laptop sitting on my table was equipped with a built-in microphone. I navigated through the settings, my raw fingers moving with speed over the cracked trackpad. I activated the audio recording software, testing the input levels by tapping softly against the plastic casing. The green audio bar spiked immediately, confirming the microphone was functioning perfectly. I moved the laptop to the edge of the plastic table, angling the microphone toward the center of the room. I draped a corner of my thin gray blanket over the glowing screen, completely concealing the device in the shadows while leaving the audio receiver unobstructed. The digital trap was securely set. Now I just needed to lure my predator directly into the snare. I looked around my concrete cell, searching for the perfect bait. My eyes landed on the heavy plastic water jug Valerie had left on the floor so near the space heater. It was nearly full, holding over a gallon of cold tap water. I slowly lowered myself from the cot, my left leg trembling under the weight, and limped toward the jug. I grasped the plastic handle, my knuckles turning white with effort, and dragged it back toward the center of the garage. I positioned my wheelchair right next to the table, ensuring I was directly in the recording path of the hidden microphone. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the inevitable violence that was about to follow. With a swift, calculated motion, I kicked the heavy water jug with my good foot. The plastic container toppled over violently. The cap popped off upon impact, sending a massive puddle of water rushing across the dusty concrete floor. The water soaked into the boxes and spread directly underneath the heavy steel fire door leading into the main house. I knew Derek was inside the mudroom, likely admiring his expensive golf clubs or polishing his imported leather shoes. All I had to do now was wait for the water to seep under the threshold and ruin his floor. The agonizing wait was excruciating. Every passing second felt like a heavy stone pressing down on my chest. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair, gripping the armrests, listening to the rhythmic dripping of the spilled water echoing in the freezing space. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel door was suddenly thrown open with terrifying explosive force. The thick metal slammed brutally against the concrete wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the garage. Derek stood framed in the doorway, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked down at the massive puddle of water seeping rapidly across his expensive floor tiles in the mudroom, and his furious gaze snapped directly to me. I shrank back into my wheelchair, instinctively playing the role of the terrified victim. But internally, my heart pounded with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. The recording software was capturing every single second. "What in the world is wrong with you?" Derek screamed, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, explosive intensity. He stomped into the garage, his heavy boots splashing loudly through the freezing water. "Are you completely stupid, Harrison? Look at what you have done to my floor." I raised my hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of defense. "I am so sorry, Derek," I whimpered, making my voice sound impossibly weak and confused. My hand just slipped. I was trying to get a drink and I lost my balance. My fingers are just so numb from the cold out here. Derek did not care about my excuses. He crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, closing the distance between us in an instant. He raised his heavy leather boot and delivered a vicious kick directly to the front wheel of my wheelchair. The powerful impact sent a jarring shockwave up my spine, forcing the chair to slide backward and slam violently against the edge of the folding table. The table rattled dangerously, spilling my cold soup bowl onto the concrete floor, but the hidden laptop, safely shielded beneath the gray blanket, remained perfectly intact. The microphone was actively recording every single metallic crash, every splash of water, and every terrifying breath Derek took. He loomed over me, his broad shoulders completely blocking out the pale light hanging from the ceiling. He grabbed the fabric of my pajama shirt with both hands, lifting me slightly out of the seat of my wheelchair. I could smell the expensive cologne radiating from his skin, a stark contrast to the vile hatred burning in his dark eyes. He leaned down, bringing his face dangerously close to mine, until I could feel the hot heat of his breath against my cheek. "Why will you not just die, you useless old cripple?" Derek hissed, his voice dropping into a low whisper that I knew the microphone was capturing perfectly. "Once you croak, I am selling this house and moving to Dubai. Die faster." He shoved me backward with terrifying force, slamming my shoulders hard against the backrest of my wheelchair. My head snapped backward, my neck aching from the sudden, violent whiplash. I gasped for air, clutching my chest, acting as though his brutal words had completely destroyed my spirit. Derek sneered at my pathetic display, wiping his hands on his expensive slacks, as if simply touching my clothing had contaminated him. "Do not make another mess in here, you pathetic old fool," he spat, turning his back on me with absolute contempt. "If I have to come back out to this garage tonight, I promise you will deeply regret it." He marched aggressively back toward the main house, his boots stomping right through the puddle of spilled water. He stepped through the threshold, grabbed the thick metal handle, and slammed the heavy fire door shut with a deafening crash. The deadbolt slid heavily into place, sealing me back into my icy prison. I sat perfectly still in the freezing darkness, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps, retreating deep into the luxurious warmth of my stolen home. Only when the absolute silence of the garage returned did I allow myself to move. I reached slowly across the folding table, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric of the blanket. I pulled the cover aside, exposing the glowing, cracked screen of the battered laptop. The audio recording software was still running smoothly, the green input bar dancing quietly in the silent room. I watched the green bar pulse one final time before I carefully reached out and pressed the trackpad. I stopped the recording. The digital file automatically saved to the battered hard drive of my laptop. I now held the irrefutable proof I desperately needed to expose their elaborate deception. The audio file captured the pure malice of Derek, his direct threat against my life, and his explicit intention to profit from my death. I navigated back to the secure browser windows I had opened earlier. I downloaded the official bank statements detailing the massive, unauthorized wire transfers into his corporate shell account. I saved the portable document format file of the durable power of attorney, the one bearing my masterfully forged signature. I gathered these 3 digital artifacts, placing them meticulously into a single heavily encrypted folder on my desktop. They were no longer just files. They were the physical embodiment of my counterattack. My bleeding fingertips hovered over the worn keyboard. The freezing temperature of the garage was severely compromising my fine motor skills. Every movement required a deliberate exertion of willpower. But the cold could not extinguish the burning determination radiating from the center of my chest. I needed to transmit this digital package to the one person in the world who possessed the strength, the loyalty, and the righteous fury required to shatter the fortress Derek had built. I opened my secure email client. I thought back to the cruel lie Valerie had told me just hours earlier. She had claimed that Lucas had blocked my numbers, that he viewed me as a massive burden, and that he had completely abandoned me to my fate. But Valerie did not understand the profound, unbreakable bond forged between a father and a son who had weathered the darkest storms of life together. Lucas was a former Marine. He operated on a strict, unwavering code of honor. He would never simply walk away from a family member in distress. He was currently blinded by the smokescreen Derek and Valerie had established, likely receiving entirely fabricated updates about my medical decline and my supposed desire for absolute isolation. I needed to pierce straight through that smokescreen. I clicked the button to compose a new message. I did not use the civilian email address Lucas maintained for his daily life. I knew Derek might have found a way to intercept standard communications. Instead, I typed in a highly secure, encrypted address from his active military days. It was a private channel we had established years ago for absolute emergencies. In the subject line, I typed 3 words that carried a very specific, undeniable weight. Protocol Black Garage. It was a phrase we had devised long ago, a signal indicating an immediate life-threatening crisis that required a swift, overwhelming response. I attached the encrypted folder containing the bank statements, the forged power of attorney, and the chilling audio recording. I did not write a long emotional message. I did not need to explain the immense suffering of the past few days or the freezing torment of my concrete cell. The attached evidence would speak with a deafening, undeniable volume. I simply typed one single sentence into the body of the email. I am trapped, and they are stealing everything. My left hand was shaking violently now, a combination of the bitter cold and the massive surge of adrenaline flooding my nervous system. I stared at the bright blue send button resting at the bottom of the cracked screen. This was the point of no return. Once this message was transmitted into the digital ether, the war would officially begin. Lucas would receive the files, he would hear the homicidal threats of Derek, and he would descend upon this house with the unstoppable force of a hurricane. I raised my trembling index finger, taking a deep, steadying breath that plumed whitely in the freezing air. I brought my finger down, firmly clicking the trackpad. A small loading icon appeared. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic scraping noise echoed loudly from the other side of the garage wall. It was the distinct sound of a key sliding roughly into the deadbolt of the heavy fire door. The upload progress bar on my screen was crawling forward at an agonizingly slow pace. 10%, 20%. The heavy steel door violently rattled in its frame. Derek was coming back. He had promised that if he had to return to the garage, I would deeply regret it. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, threatening to burst right through my chest. I desperately needed the upload to finish. 50%. 60%. The deadbolt disengaged with a loud, absolute crack. I reached out with lightning speed and ruthlessly ripped the spliced Ethernet cable directly out of the side port of the laptop. The sudden disconnection forced the email client to utilize its final cached data to push the message through the network. I did not have the luxury of waiting for the confirmation screen. I slammed the cracked lid of the laptop shut, instantly extinguishing the pale, ghostly glow illuminating my face. With one fluid, desperate motion, I shoved the heavy machine deep under the thin, lumpy mattress of my military cot. I threw my body down onto the hard surface, frantically pulling the flimsy gray blanket all the way up to my chin. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing my rigid muscles to relax completely, adopting the limp, lifeless posture of a heavily sedated man. The heavy steel door was kicked open with tremendous explosive force. It slammed brutally against the concrete block wall, rebounding slightly on its thick hinges. The heavy, aggressive stomping of leather boots echoed loudly across the freezing floor. Derek marched directly toward my corner of the garage, his breathing heavy and ragged with pure, uncontrolled anger. He stopped right at the edge of my cot. The air surrounding him radiated a dark, dangerous energy. I kept my breathing incredibly slow, incredibly deep, mimicking the exact respiratory rhythm of someone drowning in a deep, chemically induced coma. Suddenly, a blinding, brilliant beam of white light pierced straight through my closed eyelids. Derek had ignited a high-powered tactical flashlight, aiming the intense beam directly into my face from merely inches away. The sheer brightness was agonizing, burning red and orange patterns across my retinas. He was trying to force a reaction, trying to startle me into opening my eyes, so he could unleash his violent fury upon a conscious target. I held my ground. I did not flinch. I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. I kept my jaw slack, allowing a small line of saliva to escape. Derek stood there for what felt like an absolute eternity. He was silently hunting for any microscopic sign of deception. Finally, he let out a sharp, disgusted sigh. "You are nothing but a rotting, useless vegetable," he muttered. He lowered the beam, kicked the plastic table, and stomped away. The heavy steel door slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged. I lay perfectly still in the dark. The digital distress signal was successfully deployed. The countdown to my absolute retribution had officially begun. The next 48 hours dragged by with an agonizing, excruciating slowness. The calendar rolled forward to the 4th Thursday of November. It was finally the evening of Thanksgiving. For 40 years, this house had been a cherished sanctuary of incredible warmth. I used to carve a massive 20-pound bird at the head of the mahogany table, surrounded by the joyous laughter of my family. Today, the holiday served only to highlight my absolute captivity. The temperature in Chicago had plummeted overnight, dropping to a bitter -2 degrees Celsius. The detached garage trapped the freezing air like a concrete meat locker. Frost formed thick, crystalline webs across the narrow window panes. I sat huddled on the flimsy military cot, my body trembling uncontrollably. Derek had begrudgingly tossed a second blanket into the garage the previous evening, but it was a pathetic, moth-eaten scrap of wool that smelled of decay. I wrapped both thin blankets tightly around my frail shoulders, trying desperately to trap whatever meager body heat I could still physically generate. Every exhale plumed into the freezing air, forming white clouds of mist that hung heavily before dissipating. My tired joints ached with a deep throbbing intensity. The cold was relentless, seeping through my slippers and gnawing at my bones. But the freezing temperature was only half of my intense physical torment. The other half was the agonizing pain clawing viciously at my stomach. I was completely starving. I had not eaten a real solid meal in exactly 2 days. Ever since Derek threw his extremely violent tantrum, Valerie had restricted my daily rations even further. She claimed the kitchen was too busy with elaborate holiday preparations to accommodate me. My sustenance for the past 48 hours consisted entirely of dry, stale bread and half a glass of lukewarm tap water. My stomach twisted and cramped a sharp agony that demanded my attention. Standing up from the low cot required a monumental, deliberate effort, my tired muscles constantly screaming in harsh protest. Yet the true psychological torture came from the brutal sensory assault seeping directly through the shared drywall of the garage. Inside my beautifully designed home, Derek was hosting a lavish Thanksgiving feast. He had invited a dozen of his associates, the ruthless crypto investors, who were actively helping him siphon away my life savings. Through the thin drywall, I could hear the arrogant, booming laughter of wealthy men who genuinely believed they were completely untouchable. The heavy thumping bass of a high-end sound system vibrated through the solid concrete floor. I heard the sharp, crystalline clinking of imported champagne glasses toasting to their massive, fraudulent success tonight. Worse than the terrible vibrating noise, however, were the entirely inescapable smells. The commercial exhaust fan I had personally installed in the kitchen was actively venting directly over the garage roof, pushing the rich aromas of the feast downward into my icy cell. The mouth-watering scent of a roasted turkey drifted steadily through the drafty cracks around the heavy fire door. It was swiftly followed by the savory aroma of garlic mashed potatoes, rich buttery gravy, and warm, freshly baked artisan bread. My stomach clenched violently at the overwhelming smell, producing an audible, hollow rumble. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing myself to swallow the bitter saliva. They were feasting like kings, drinking highly expensive wine paid for by the sweat of my demanding 40-year career, while I sat shivering and starving on a broken cot in the dark. I listened closely as the raucous party transitioned from the formal dining room to the outdoor stone patio bordering the garage. The heavy glass sliding doors rolled open, and a loud burst of warm, festive energy spilled into the freezing night. Derek and his wealthy guests stepped outside to smoke. Within a few short seconds, the thick, pungent odor of premium Cuban cigars penetrated the small ventilation duct. I could hear their voices with absolute crystal clarity. Derek was holding court, his tone dripping with the arrogant swagger of a man who had successfully conquered an empire. He bragged openly about the massive returns on his recent digital investments, casually throwing around figures in the high hundreds of thousands. He spoke of the sprawling house as if he had built it, pointing out the intricate architectural details I designed as his own additions. Every arrogant boast, every booming laugh, every single clink of a glass was a fresh, sharp knife twisted deeply into my chest. Valerie was out there too, her shrill laugh rising clearly above the rumbling voices of the men. She was playing the perfect adoring hostess, completely unbothered by the absolute fact that her own father was locked in a freezing concrete box, just on the other side of the brick wall, slowly starving to death. She had completely detached herself from any moral obligation, fully embracing the stolen luxury Derek provided. They were celebrating a beautiful holiday by shamelessly reveling in the massive theft of my life. I pulled the moth-eaten blankets tightly around my bare neck, resting my tired back heavily against the freezing concrete wall. The physical pain was immense, testing the very limits of my endurance, but I absolutely refused to let it break my resolve. The brutal cold and the agonizing hunger were merely temporary conditions. They were simply the difficult physical reality of my tactical position. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the digital package I had successfully transmitted 2 nights ago. The encrypted email was out there. Protocol Black had been officially initiated. The forged power of attorney, the detailed bank statements proving the massive theft, and the chilling audio recording were no longer hidden secrets. They were highly explosive digital weapons currently sitting safely in the secure inbox of a fiercely loyal former Marine. I knew my son Lucas better than absolutely anyone else. I knew the specific, terrifying quiet that would instantly settle over him when he saw the irrefutable proof of what they were doing to his father. He would not call to demand an explanation. He would not send a quick warning text. He would not give them the slightest opportunity to prepare a legal defense or spin away the damning evidence. He would simply move. He would simply pack his tactical gear, get into his heavy truck, and drive straight through the country with a singular, unstoppable purpose in mind. Derek laughed loudly again, a booming, triumphant sound that literally shook the frosted window of the garage. He was toasting to his future, completely unaware that his stolen foundation had already been rigged for a total catastrophic demolition. I took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air, feeling the icy bite deep in my tired lungs. Let them feast, I told myself, a cold, hard smile slowly forming in the darkness of the garage. Let them drink the expensive champagne and smoke the imported cigars. Let them enjoy this final stolen night of absolute luxury. Because the distress message had been successfully received, the trap was perfectly primed, and the devastating storm of my ultimate retribution was already speeding rapidly down the highway, heading straight for my door. The loud music vibrating through the concrete floor subsided around midnight. The raucous laughter faded as Derek bid his fraudulent associates a warm farewell. I heard expensive engines roar to life, tires crunching heavily against the frozen gravel as they drove away. The sudden silence was oppressive, a stark contrast to the celebration that mocked my starvation. I remained huddled on the flimsy military cot, pulling the 2 moth-eaten blankets tight against my frame. The bitter cold of the garage was absolute, numbing my fingers and toes. My stomach twisted violently, a sharp agony reminding me I had not consumed a solid meal in over 48 hours. I closed my eyes, focusing my mind entirely on the digital trap I had set. Suddenly, the metallic scrape of the deadbolt shattered the freezing silence. The thick steel fire door groaned loudly on its hinges, swinging inward to reveal the bright light of the mudroom. Derek stood in the doorway, wearing his tailored trousers and a crisp white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He held a clear plastic Tupperware container in his right hand. He stepped into the freezing garage, leaving the door wide open, allowing a brief wave of central heating to wash over my shivering face. The rich smell of roasted turkey and savory gravy instantly flooded the damp air, making my empty stomach clench with unbearable intensity. Derek walked slowly toward my cot, a cruel smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of absolute disgust and arrogant triumph. He did not see a structural engineer or the man who paid for his roof. He saw an obstacle he had successfully crushed. He held out the plastic container, shaking it slightly. The contents rattled against the plastic walls with a dull, heavy sound. I stared at the Tupperware, my vision blurring slightly from the intense hunger gnawing at my insides. "I brought you some Thanksgiving dinner, old man." Derek sneered, his voice dripping with pure malice. "Valerie thought you might be getting a little bit hungry out here. It is a holiday after all. We cannot let you starve completely to death on a holiday." He did not wait for my hands. He flipped his wrist and dropped the cheap plastic container directly onto my lap. It landed heavily against my thighs, the loose lid popping off. I looked down at the food he brought me. It was not a plate of warm meat. It was an offensive, degrading pile of literal garbage. The container was filled entirely with discarded bone scraps, tough gristle, and thick lumps of congealed yellow fat. There was a stripped turkey leg devoid of actual meat, and a pile of soggy skin scraped from a roasting pan. It was the refuse they would have thrown into the trash, the scraps unfit for a dog, brought to me as a calculated insult. The sheer cruelty of the gesture ignited a fire deep within my chest, a burning heat that pushed back the freezing chill. I stared at the greasy bones on my lap, feeling the oily residue seep through my blanket. For days I had played the role they demanded. I had been the broken, sedated, confused old man, trembling in the shadows. I had slurred my words, lowered my eyes, and accepted their abuse to build my case. But the distress signal was sent. The trap was sprung. I no longer needed to maintain this pathetic facade. I slowly pushed the container off my lap, letting it clatter loudly onto the freezing concrete floor. The greasy bones scattered across the dust. I raised my head, straightening my spine against the wall, and looked Derek directly in the eye. I did not blink. I shed the fragile persona like a heavy coat. "I do not want your garbage, Derek," I said. My voice was no longer a weak, rattling whisper. It was steady, resonant, and laced with the hard authority I had utilized to command massive construction crews for 4 decades. The sudden shift in my tone caught him entirely off guard. His arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. "I demand that you bring me my actual prescribed cardiovascular medication." Immediately, I stated clearly, my eyes locking onto his with a piercing intensity. "And I require a functional space heater in this room tonight. The temperature is dropping to dangerous levels, and this environment is completely unacceptable." Derek stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep, irritated disbelief. He had spent the last several weeks heavily drugging my soup, isolating me from the world, and mentally conditioning himself to believe I was completely destroyed. Hearing me speak with such crystal-clear clarity severely bruised his fragile, monstrous ego. His confusion rapidly mutated into a dark, defensive fury. He hated that I was not behaving like the defeated animal he desperately needed me to be. "You demand," Derek repeated, his voice rising in volume, echoing sharply against the concrete walls. "You demand things from me in my own house." He took a menacing step forward, kicking the plastic container with his expensive leather shoe. The Tupperware shattered against the brick wall, sending scraps of gristle flying. "You do not demand anything, you pathetic, useless old cripple. You do not make the rules here anymore." He closed the distance between us in an instant. Before I could raise my weak arms to defend myself, Derek drew back his hand and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across the left side of my face. The physical impact was explosive, a deafening crack ringing through the icy air. My head snapped violently to the side, my neck aching from the sudden force. A sharp, stinging heat flooded my cheek, completely overpowering the numb cold. I tasted the distinct flavor of warm blood welling up where my teeth had bitten down hard into the soft inner lining of my cheek. I could feel a dark, ugly bruise already beginning to form beneath the surface of my skin. I slowly turned my head back to face him. My ear was ringing with a high-pitched whine, but I maintained my steady, unbroken gaze. I did not raise a hand to soothe my stinging face. I simply stared at him, memorizing every single detail of his cowardly, violent outburst. This physical assault was the final validation of everything I had documented in my encrypted message to Lucas. Derek leaned in close, his chest heaving with aggressive breaths. He pointed a long, threatening finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with a manic energy. "You think you are so smart playing games, trying to act like you are still in control?" he hissed, his voice trembling with homicidal rage. "But you have absolutely nothing left. We took everything from you, Harrison. Your money, your house, your dignity. It all belongs to me now." He backed away slightly, adjusting his expensive white shirt with a sharp tug. He looked down at me with absolute finality. "I am entirely done dealing with your stubborn nonsense," he declared, his voice dropping into a deadly register. "Tomorrow morning, bright and early, I am signing the final medical transfer papers. I am having you legally committed to the worst, most poorly funded state psychiatric asylum I can find. You are going to rot in a locked ward with heavily medicated lunatics for the rest of your miserable life." He turned his back on me, his boots crunching loudly over the scattered turkey bones resting on the concrete floor. He paused right at the threshold of the fire door, the warm light from the mudroom casting a long shadow across my cot. "Enjoy your last night of freedom, old man," Derek said softly, looking over his shoulder with a chilling sneer. "Tomorrow you disappear from our lives forever." He stepped through the doorway and slammed the heavy steel door shut with a tremendous crash. The deadbolt slid into place, sealing me into the freezing darkness once more. The throbbing pain in my cheek burned intensely, a sharp contrast to the biting cold settling over the rest of my body. My stomach cramped, screaming for the nourishment he had cruelly denied me. I was isolated, battered, scheduled for a permanent erasure the very next morning. By all rational metrics, I should have been completely broken. But as I sat there in the dark, feeling the warm blood pool slowly in my mouth, I felt a profound sense of calm wash over my weary soul. Derek had made his ultimate fatal miscalculation. He honestly believed he held all the cards. He believed his forged documents and his physical violence had secured his victory. He did not realize that by striking me, by speaking those horrible threats out loud, in a space I meticulously monitored, he had firmly sealed his own inescapable doom. I wiped a drop of blood from my mouth with my trembling hand. I pulled the thin blankets tight against my shivering chest and closed my eyes. I did not need to fear the morning. I just needed to survive the freezing night. Because I knew with absolute certainty that when the sun rose tomorrow, Derek would not be the one opening that heavy steel door. Lucas was coming. The storm was here. The heavy steel fire door reverberated in its frame long after the deadbolt ground into the locking plate. I sat in the absolute freezing darkness, my chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The sharp sting of the slap radiated across my left cheek, a burning emblem of Derek and his profound cowardice. I raised my trembling fingers to my skin, feeling the raised, swollen welt that was already beginning to tighten. The physical pain was sharp, but the psychological clarity it provided was completely invaluable. He had shown his true nature, discarding the mask of a burdened caregiver. He revealed the violent parasite lurking beneath his tailored clothes. I pulled the two moth-eaten blankets tightly around my shivering shoulders, drawing my knees up to my chest to conserve the rapidly escaping body heat. The temperature in the concrete cell felt as though it had dropped another 5 degrees. Beyond the reinforced drywall, the sickening sounds of the lavish holiday celebration immediately resumed. The pulsing rhythm of a deep jazz bass line vibrated through the floorboards, an arrogant soundtrack to their monumental theft. I could hear the muffled, high-pitched laughter of Valerie and the booming, confident voices. Derek and his wealthy associates were entirely unbothered by the violence that had just transpired just feet away from their expensive dining table. They believed the problem was successfully contained, that I was a broken, defeated entity, waiting quietly for the state asylum transport in the morning. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind to detach from the agonizing hunger, twisting my stomach into painful knots. I needed to remain vigilant. I needed to stay completely awake. I focused entirely on the steady, rhythmic dripping of the spilled water, freezing onto the icy concrete floor. Exactly 10 minutes passed before the catastrophic shift finally occurred. The throbbing bass line of the jazz music was abruptly severed in the middle of a measure. The faint ambient hum of the central heating unit, which had been a constant mocking presence through the walls, instantly died. The sliver of warm yellow light that usually leaked under the bottom of the fire door vanished, plunging the entire structure into a profound, suffocating pitch black. The power to the sprawling million-dollar property had been completely and deliberately severed from the external grid. The sudden, encompassing silence was heavier than the extremely freezing winter air. It settled over the property with a terrifying, ominous weight. It was not a random rolling blackout. The surrounding suburban neighborhood was still illuminated, their distant holiday lights, reflecting faintly off the frost-covered narrow windows of my freezing garage cell. The momentary confused silence upstairs quickly erupted into a chaotic symphony of pure panic. The sharp clicking of expensive high heels scrambling across the hardwood floors echoed loudly above me. I heard Valerie shriek in genuine alarm, her voice rising in a panicked crescendo as the pitch-black darkness consumed her perfect holiday gathering. Derek yelled out incredibly loudly. His voice was laced with sudden, unexpected fear, demanding to know why the automatic backup generator had not instantly engaged. He cursed loudly, blaming the electrical contractors, entirely unaware that the failure was not a mechanical glitch. The fortress he had so meticulously stolen was being systematically dismantled. I sat up slightly on the flimsy military cot, ignoring the sharp protest of my aching cold joints. The deep agonizing cramps in my empty stomach temporarily subsided entirely, replaced by a potent electric surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooding through my veins. I knew exactly what was happening. This was revenge. This was the opening maneuver of a highly calculated tactical siege. The elaborate distress signal I had transmitted out into the digital ether had successfully reached its intended target. Protocol Black was not merely a warning signal indicating pain. It was an activation sequence designed for absolute overwhelming intervention. Derek and his fraudulent associates were currently trapped inside a dark, freezing mansion, completely blind to the righteous fury descending upon them. The psychological dynamic of the environment had instantly inverted. I was no longer the helpless, isolated prisoner waiting to be discarded. I had become the silent spectator watching everything. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen beyond the muffled, frantic shouting echoing from the main house. I focused all my remaining energy on the crisp, silent air outside the thin, uninsulated walls of the detached garage. Through the frosted window panes, a massive dark shadow blotted out the pale moonlight, illuminating the driveway. I heard the low rumbling growl of a heavy-duty diesel engine abruptly cut off, followed by the solid, unmistakable thud of a heavy vehicle door closing with deliberate force. Then came the sound. It was the slow, rhythmic crunch of extremely heavy tactical boots. They stepped deliberately onto the frozen gravel of the driveway. The footsteps did not rush. They moved with a terrifying, predatory calm, measuring the perimeter of the property with the precise, calculated intent of a seasoned combat veteran. Every crunch of the gravel sounded like a countdown clock ticking toward an inevitable, explosive conclusion. The footsteps bypassed the grand front entrance of the main house entirely. The intruder knew exactly where the primary objective was located. The heavy boots moved steadily along the exterior wall of my concrete cell. The footsteps stopped directly outside the exterior garage side entrance door. This side door of the garage was a solid, heavy wooden barrier, reinforced with steel plating, designed to withstand severe weather and prevent unwanted intrusions. For the past month, it had served as the impenetrable blockade sealing me away from the outside world. I heard the faint metallic scraping of a hand briefly testing the exterior doorknob, confirming that Derek had indeed locked the deadbolt. A profound, heavy silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. It was the calm, gathered breath before a massive structural collapse. I instinctively pulled the moth-eaten blankets higher up around my bruised cheek and face. Bracing my frail body against the brick wall, I knew the man standing on the other side of that wooden barrier. I knew his uncompromising nature, his fierce loyalty, and his absolute intolerance for those who preyed upon the weak and the vulnerable. The reinforced side door did not just open. It was violently, explosively obliterated. A massive concussive boom rocked the entire foundation of the garage as a heavy boot struck the center of the wood with the force of a battering ram. The heavy steel deadbolt instantly tore straight through the wooden frame, sending jagged, razor-sharp splinters of wood flying violently across the dusty concrete floor. The door flew entirely off its heavy metal hinges, crashing down onto the ground with a deafening, catastrophic clatter. The freezing winter wind instantly howled into the garage, swirling the dust and debris into a chaotic frenzy. A massive, imposing silhouette stood framed in the shattered doorway, blocking out the bright starlight. The figure was broad-shouldered, standing well over 6 feet tall, radiating an aura of suppressed, lethal violence. A blinding beam of white light erupted from a tactical flashlight held firmly in his steady right hand. He stood still. The beam swept rapidly across the destroyed, freezing space. It illuminated the mountain of black trash bags, the shattered pieces of the plastic Tupperware container, and the greasy, discarded turkey bones scattered across the floor. Finally, the piercing light found the flimsy military cot in the far corner. The beam pinned me against the brick wall. I raised a trembling, raw hand to shield my eyes from the intense glare. The light instantly dipped, pointing down toward the concrete floor, so as not to blind me while still providing enough illumination to reveal the absolute horror of my terrible captivity entirely. In the ambient glow, the massive silhouette took a step forward into the garage. He saw the 2 moth-eaten blankets draped over my shivering, emaciated frame. He saw the sharp, sunken lines of my starved face, and he saw the dark, swelling, purple bruise Derek had just violently inflicted. The imposing figure stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy tactical flashlight trembled ever so slightly in his massive hand as the full, undeniable reality of my condition registered in his mind. He slowly reached up and pulled back the dark hood covering his head. It was my son, Lucas. Lucas had returned. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his cheek twitched, and his dark eyes burned with an intense, terrifying sorrow, mixed with an absolute homicidal rage. He did not rush forward with frantic questions. He moved with a heartbreaking, measured gentleness, crossing the freezing room and dropping slowly to his knees right beside my broken cot. He completely ignored the freezing water and the greasy bones on the floor. He reached out his strong, warm hand, gently gripping my freezing shoulder. His voice was deadly calm. "I got your email, Dad. I am here." I looked into the eyes of my son. The dark fury burning behind his stoic expression was terrifying to behold, yet to me it was the warmest sight I had ever witnessed. I tried to speak to warn him about the men upstairs, but my throat could only produce a dry rasp. Lucas gently raised his large hand, placing a warm finger against my bruised cheek. His touch was incredibly light, a compassionate contrast to the brutal slap I had endured just a few hours prior. He slowly moved his gaze over my frail frame, taking in the moth-eaten blankets, the freezing concrete, the scattered bones, and the absolute squalor of my captivity. I watched the dense muscles in his thick neck tighten. He did not need me to explain the horrors of the past month. The encrypted files had provided the raw financial data, but seeing his beloved father discarded like garbage provided the visceral, agonizing truth. He reached down and firmly gripped my trembling hand, transferring a powerful surge of strength directly into my exhausted body. "I am going to end this right now," Lucas whispered, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, lethal promise. Before I could nod in silent agreement, the heavy steel fire door connecting the garage to the main mudroom was violently thrown open. Derek stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim emergency lighting. In his hands, he gripped a heavy titanium golf club, holding it high above his shoulder. He had clearly rushed downstairs, expecting to find a common trespasser during the blackout. "Who the hell is in here?" Derek bellowed, his voice laced with an arrogant bravado that failed to hide his panic. "I will break your skull open." He stepped aggressively into the freezing garage, the club swishing through the frigid air. He took 3 long strides forward before the beam of Lucas's tactical flashlight swung around, catching Derek perfectly in its blinding glare. Derek froze instantly, his polished leather shoes skidding on the damp concrete. He raised a hand to shield his eyes, when his vision adjusted and he recognized the massive, imposing figure standing calmly between him and my broken cot. All the artificial courage drained from his pale face. He knew exactly who Lucas was, and he knew what Lucas was capable of doing. But Derek was a coward trapped in a corner, and cowards often substitute foolish aggression for actual bravery. He tightened his grip on the golf club, forcing a desperate sneer onto his flushed face. "Get the hell out of my house right now," Derek shouted, pointing the end of the metal shaft directly at Lucas's chest. "Your old man is crazy, completely out of his mind, and his pension belongs to me now. He signed it all over. I have the legal documents to prove it." Lucas did not argue. He did not raise his voice, and he did not attempt to engage in a heated debate with a man who had systematically tortured his father. He simply stared at Derek with the cold, detached gaze of a professional soldier evaluating a highly hostile threat. The absolute silence emanating from my son was infinitely more terrifying than any loud, aggressive threat he could have possibly spoken. Slowly, with an agonizingly deliberate precision, Lucas began to move. He reached up and smoothly unzipped his dark winter jacket. He pulled his broad shoulders free from the thick material, letting the heavy garment drop carelessly onto the dusty concrete floor. Underneath, he wore a simple, fitted black shirt that highlighted the dense muscles of his arms and chest. Derek took a hesitant half-step backward, his eyes darting nervously toward the shattered remains of the exterior side door, silently calculating his odds of a successful retreat. Lucas completely ignored the subtle, cowardly movement. He raised his left wrist and slowly, methodically unbuckled his heavy metal watch. He did not take his burning eyes off Derek for a single fraction of a second. Lucas turned slightly and placed the expensive timepiece carefully onto the surface of a dusty wooden workbench sitting just a few feet away from my cot. The small metallic clink of the watch settling onto the wood echoed sharply in the freezing, tense air. It was a clear, unmistakable declaration of violent intent. Derek realized in that exact moment that his arrogant words and forged legal documents held absolutely no power in this isolated room. He was completely outmatched, driven entirely by a sudden surge of blind, cornered panic. With a loud, desperate yell, Derek lunged forward, swinging the heavy titanium golf club with all the wild, uncontrolled force he could physically muster. He aimed directly for the side of Lucas's head, intending to cause catastrophic damage. The metal shaft sliced rapidly through the freezing air, but it never even came close to reaching its intended target. Lucas moved with a blindingly fast, explosive precision that was utterly breathtaking to witness. He did not retreat. He stepped smoothly and aggressively inside the wide, sloppy arc of the swinging weapon. In one fluid, seamless motion, he raised his thick forearm, executing a flawless, punishing parry that instantly deflected the titanium shaft harmlessly into the empty air above them. Before Derek could even attempt to pull the club back for a secondary strike, Lucas drove his right hand forward in a devastating counterattack. He grabbed Derek's swinging arm just below the elbow and twisted it violently outward with immense, unforgiving pressure. A sickening, incredibly loud crack echoed through the garage as the bones in Derek's wrist completely shattered. Derek let out a scream of pure agony, dropping the golf club instantly as his shattered hand became useless. But Lucas was not finished. He maintained his iron grip on Derek's broken arm, using the attacker's own forward momentum against him. With a sweeping motion of his tactical boot, Lucas kicked Derek's legs out from under him. The leg sweep sent the arrogant son-in-law crashing face first into the hard concrete floor. The brutal impact silenced his screams, leaving him groaning and writhing helplessly in a pool of spilled water. He clutched his mangled wrist against his chest, completely neutralized and utterly broken in 2 short seconds. I watched the scene unfold with a profound sense of righteous justice. Just as the metallic clatter of the dropped golf club settled, the heavy fire door swung open once again. Valerie ran frantically into the garage, holding a smartphone in her trembling hands. She stopped abruptly, taking in the terrifying scene of absolute destruction. She saw the shattered exterior door, the broken Tupperware, and Derek lying immobilized on the floor. Her eyes finally landed on Lucas, standing calmly over his defeated opponent. "You are a maniac!" Valerie screamed in terror, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined space. "I am calling police right now. You are going to rot in jail for this, Lucas. You are going to prison for assault." Lucas simply looked down at Derek, a cold smirk slowly forming on his face. "You do not have to bother making that call, Valerie," Lucas said, his voice ringing with authority. "They are already here." Almost immediately, the dark frosted windows of the garage exploded with chaotic flashes of red and blue light. The piercing wail of police sirens cut through the night air, completely shattering the dead silence. Heavy tactical vehicles roared up the frozen gravel driveway, their tires crunching right up to the shattered threshold of the side door. A dozen armed federal agents swarmed the property, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison. They poured into the freezing concrete cell, their bright flashlights sweeping over the grim reality of my captivity. They saw the moth-eaten blankets, the scattered bones, and Derek writhing helplessly in the puddle of spilled water. 2 uniformed officers hauled Derek to his feet, ignoring his pathetic screams as they secured his uninjured wrist. Valerie pressed herself against the brick wall, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as a female agent began reading her rights. A tall man wearing a dark windbreaker stepped forward, assessing the scene with a calm, professional gaze. Lucas turned from Derek and approached the lead agent. My son was not just a highly trained former Marine. Following his honorable discharge, Lucas utilized his analytical skills to become a forensic auditor for a major cybersecurity firm. When he received my encrypted distress signal, he did not just fly out to rescue me. He went to work. From a terminal on his flight, Lucas had dismantled Derek's financial shell game. Lucas handed a thick manila folder to the federal agent. The folder contained a comprehensive, undeniable digital blood trail. "I have tracked every single stolen dollar," Lucas stated, his voice steady. "I penetrated his limited liability company, traced the offshore transfers, and frozen every hidden cryptocurrency wallet. The money is entirely locked down. Furthermore, we filed formal federal charges for massive wire fraud, aggravated forgery, and severe elder abuse." Derek let out a pathetic sob of absolute despair. The arrogant cryptocurrency investor was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken coward. His expensive clothing was soaked in freezing water, and his face was twisted in pain from his shattered wrist. The police dragged him out of the garage, his boots dragging across the concrete floor as he whimpered into the night air. Valerie watched her husband being hauled away, and the reality of her impending destruction finally crashed down upon her. She fell heavily to her knees on the hard concrete floor. She looked up at me, hot tears streaming down her pale face. She clasped her trembling hands together in a desperate gesture. "Dad, please," Valerie begged, her voice cracking with manufactured sorrow. "Please forgive me. Derek forced me to do all of this. He manipulated me. I was terrified of him. I never wanted you to be out here in the cold. Please do not let them take me away." I sat on the edge of the flimsy cot, the thin blankets still wrapped around my shivering shoulders. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the dirty water, searching her face for any trace of the little girl I had raised. But there was nothing left. The greed and the cruelty had hollowed her out completely. I stared at her, my expression devoid of emotion. "You stood in a warm house while I froze," I said, my voice echoing coldly. "You bought designer clothes with the money I spent a lifetime building. But most importantly, you lied about Lucas. You twisted his honor to break my spirit." I looked at the greasy, discarded turkey bones scattered across the floor right next to her trembling knees. "When you let that man feed me scraps like a dog, you permanently stopped being my daughter." Valerie let out a shattered wail, burying her face in her hands, as two federal agents gently but firmly pulled her to her feet and escorted her out of the garage. I did not watch her leave. I simply reached out and gripped the steady hand of my son. He wrapped his warm jacket around my shoulders, lifting me effortlessly from the broken cot and carrying me out of the darkness and into the bright lights. Exactly 1 month later, the freezing concrete cell of the Chicago garage felt like a distant nightmare. I sat comfortably in a large rocking chair on a sun-drenched wooden porch in rural Texas. The air was wonderfully warm, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. I held a large ceramic mug of hot premium dark roast coffee in my hands, letting the soothing heat seep deep into my palms. My left leg had regained a tremendous amount of strength through intensive physical therapy, and the ugly purple bruise on my cheek had faded into nothing more than a faint memory. I took a deep sip of the rich coffee, watching with absolute joy as my grandson chased a golden retriever across the sprawling green lawn of Lucas's ranch. The aftermath of my rescue had been swift and utterly devastating for my captors. The legal hammer had fallen with an uncompromising weight. Derek was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, stripped of his tailored suits and arrogant swagger. The prosecutors had utilized the detailed forensic evidence Lucas compiled to secure an airtight indictment. Derek was facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison for massive wire fraud, forged power of attorney, and aggravated elder abuse. His offshore accounts had been completely drained, the stolen funds securely restored to my personal control. He would spend the next 2 decades in a concrete cell far smaller and far more unforgiving than the one he had designed for me. Valerie had not escaped the sweeping consequences of her terrible choices. Without Derek's stolen wealth to shield her, her artificial world had collapsed entirely. She was broke, formally evicted from the house my money originally purchased, and facing serious felony accessory charges. She had attempted to call me twice from a public defender's office, weeping and begging for financial assistance to secure a better legal team. I had instructed Lucas to permanently block her number. She had made her bed, and now she had to sleep in it. I had successfully reclaimed my life savings, my physical health, and my absolute personal dignity. I set the warm ceramic mug down on the small wooden table beside my rocking chair. I leaned back, closing my eyes and letting the bright Texas sun wash over my face. The journey through the freezing darkness had been brutal, testing the limits of my physical endurance and psychological resilience. But I had survived. I opened my eyes, watching my son walk across the lawn to scoop his laughing child up into his strong arms. I smiled, feeling a profound peace settle deeply into my heart. There are people who mistake an old man's silence for absolute weakness. They assume advanced age automatically equals helpless vulnerability. They look at a lifetime of quiet labor and mistake it for a target. They think a lion trapped inside a cold cage somehow forgets how to be a fierce, dangerous lion. But they always forget one simple, inevitable truth of nature. Eventually, the lion's cub comes home, and he brings the whole pride with him.